战略必将遭到全面和彻底的失败。
主义的火炬照亮人类前行之路，不断崛起、不断扩大的国际影响力。
I think, isolating Russia will make matters worse. It will complicate things. It will not benefit, and it has not been as effective as a strategy as perhaps the US thought it would be when this idea was first conceived. I mean, 3 weeks back we were saying that getting Russia out of the SWIFT system will bring things to a collapse in Russia. It hasn't. Alternatives are found. So my view is that engaging Russia may be better rather than completely trying to isolate it. Let's begin the debate with you. Derek Grossman, please, from California. Derek.
Well, thanks for having me. And so in my view, I think that the United States has attempted to engage Russia prior to the war. And you saw that at a very high level. You saw President Joe Biden speaking directly with President Vladimir Putin. And engagement, frankly, did not work. I mean, I think that's very obvious starting on February 24th, when Russia launched its so-called special military operation into Ukraine, which turned out being a full-scale invasion of the country. And so now we are at a time where, of course, you seek diplomatic off-ramps to the war. So engagement doesn't just, end. Engagement's always on the table. But at this point, I mean, frankly, Arnab, I think that your run-up about, this kind of binary calculation of whether to engage or not is frankly incorrect. I think that it is a spectrum, right? It is a gray area. Sometimes you engage a little bit, sometimes you ignore a little bit, right? And you kind of see what works. On your broader point about sanctions not being effective, I think we need to wait and see how this plays out. And of course, the U.S., in conjunction with its allies and partners, is looking for assistance to try to impose costs on Russia for continuing this military campaign against Ukraine. And India is one of those countries that the United States is hoping will assist. And we all, I appreciate this, and I'm sure many of my colleagues do as well. India has a non-aligned policy, and so India wants to stay out of engaging on this particular issue. And plus, it has a long-standing relationship with Russia dating back to the Cold War. So I get that, but that doesn't mean that the U.S. is going to be happy with its like-minded democratic partner India not helping out to get Russia to stand down in Ukraine.
Yes. Well, I can only say that it'll be very unfortunate if the United States does not understand the practical limitations on any sovereign country of deciding its own policy. But and that I'm saying in the context of India, Derek, I'd like to go across right now to John Mark Dugan, and only small tempted to give a counter to you, Derek, and that is that the fact of the matter is that you do not have an alternative. You, as in the West, does not have an alternative to Russian energy supply, Europe is completely dependent on Russia for oil and gas, and even Norway is dependent on Russia. I mean, I think that unless you have an alternative source of energy, then trying to isolate Russia in words and not in deed will not work. But I'd like John to respond to you on this. John, we are debating tonight. Simple proposition: can you cut off Russia from planet Earth?
Absolutely not. And, I'm over here right now. I've been over here for 5 years. Sanctions are absolutely not working at all. The only thing sanctions are doing is they're hurting the American economy. But this gentleman here in California, he's talking about like how Joe Biden tried to have meaningful engagement. And this is BS. I mean, it's not true at all. Engagement is a meaningful dialogue and not bullying tactics to push your country's interests on the counter interest of another country. There are some very important issues that Russia needs to be focused on, that the United States has been pushing Ukraine into, that are absolutely against Russian interests and Russian security. And, the imperialists in the West, they just don't understand that Russia may have different security interests than the United States. But, it's always been a red line for Ukraine to be in NATO, and this was going to happen very soon. Putin only wanted guarantees that Ukraine would not be a NATO nation, and Biden and Zelensky, they refused to agree on this. So it's understandable on this fact. Not to mention that, Ukraine, they're not saints. They've been killing people wholesale in Donbass for the last 8 years. They've killed 14,000 men, women, and children who had nothing more, who did nothing more than speak Russian. So, this constant pushing, this weaponizing of sanctions to try to hurt Russia, which hasn't hurt Russia. It's made it a little more difficult here for the people, but it's going to hurt the U.S. a heck of a lot more.
Let me take that. Let me take that across to the Ukrainian diplomat joining us from Kiev, Alexander. We are getting a lot of Twitter and feedback to the program. One question which comes from one of our viewers, I'd like to put that to you. It comes from Aditya, who says, if the US was not isolated when it bombed Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan and wherever it wanted in the garb of liberation, why should Russia be? It's a very relevant question. What would be the appropriate answer to that question, Alexander?
Well, that if something was done wrong by the United States in previous times, it doesn't mean that in this case the United States and the West is wrong. Let's reframe it. Let's imagine China and Pakistan are beginning war with India and bombing and killing innocent people. So the world needs to just to step back and to watch that two these powers or each of these powers are doing what they are doing. It's the position that you are trying to push forward. And let me refer to the gentleman before me. I'm from Donetsk. I'm Russian speaking. I'm not an ethnic Ukrainian. And I'm saying that this war is not about protecting Russian speakers. And it's lies that Ukraine killed 14,000 people since 2014. It's because Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, illegally annexed Crimea and my native city of Donetsk, and it's been occupied for 8 years. And now they launched a full-scale war. And given that Russia is a UN security member and we have the veto power, and it's a nuclear power, the only way how to deal with it and on the international scene is to impose costs on it. And that's why sanctions are so important. Yes, sanctions didn't work as we wanted to work. I mean, in Kiev, that Russia is run out of resources to wage its aggressive war. But these sanctions put Russia back in decades of economic development. And that's why it's a cost imposed on Russia. And certainly support of the West, and especially in defense support,
it's not true.
Financial support of Ukraine to preserve our sovereignty is something really important. That's why we should not talk about isolating Russia. We should talk about putting pressure on Russia to stop its war.
Yeah, see,
this is not true at all.
That's probably a more practical way of looking at it. Mark wanted to respond. Yeah, okay, Mark.
Yeah, so look, this is not true about sanctions. It hasn't hurt Russia, and what it is doing, it's crippling the U.S. dollar, okay? It's crippling the dollar. We got a new alliance between Russia and China and India because of these three countries, and probably Iran and North Korea, they're sick of the imperialist America and the American attitude and the attitude of the West, thinking that they can just push their values on everybody else. And, you can sit there and laugh all you want, but you're absolutely wrong. Look at what happened. Look at what's happening in the United States with inflation since this invasion started. It's unprecedented. And, I mean, I'm sitting here in Moscow, and nobody's really noticing much of a difference at all. Putin has tied the ruble to commodities now, and since Putin has tied the rubles to commodities, it's holding steady at 90. So this idea that these sanctions are going to cripple Russia, it's ridiculous.
Has there been a miscalculation? I mean, no, I didn't still get an answer, and I want to take that to Professor Ronald Grigor-Suni. What is the West's alternative to its dependence on Russian gas? There isn't an alternative. And second proposition, Professor Suni, that I would put before you, and I'd like you to respond, is that if you isolate Russia, then you will extend this war, and then as you're extending this war, the petrodollar will cease to exist. And if the petrodollar ceases to exist, and people start buying gas in other currencies, every country will deal with things their own way. Economy also does not like a vacuum. Petrodollar collapses, American economy collapses. The entire American economy is built on the premise of the petrodollar. So I think America is risking a lot. America's got more to lose. Don't you think so? Professor Ronald, please.
I think you're going to have to wait a long time for the American economy to collapse. It's much too powerful, and there might be a problem with inflation, but this is nothing like what's going on in the East there. First of all, let me begin by saying that your pictures, the ones you're showing of what's going on in Ukraine, are themselves an appropriate condemnation of Russia's unprovoked war against its neighbor. So that's where you begin, that this war was unnecessary. Whatever the geopolitical and strategic situation was before February 24th of this year, suddenly the world changed when Putin made this, I think, blunderous and vicious move against its neighbor. And the question is that you asked about Russia and isolation. Can Russia be isolated? Think about it. Who's doing the isolating? Hasn't Putin himself self-isolated Russia? Thousands of Russians are leaving Russia. Friends of mine are leaving Russia. Intellectuals, professors, all kinds of entrepreneurs and journalists are leaving. And Putin has essentially given Biden what he could not have expected in the short term. He's himself isolated Russia. He's turned Russia into an international pariah state. He's strengthened NATO. He had made neutral states think about joining NATO, even Finland and Sweden. He's ended the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So in many ways, Russia is doing something that Biden may have, in fact, wanted. He's done it himself. To answer your question, Russia itself is a producer, important producer, particularly for Europe, of oil, gas, and other hydrochemicals. There's no question about that. But Europe has made a strategic choice, and one very dangerous for, I think, not only Russia, but for the world as well. It's decided to move away from connections, economic and so forth, from Russia toward a strategic choice toward the United States, which now will become a major supplier of these hydrochemicals to Europe. Imagine this. Germany has agreed to rearm in a way that it never has before.
That's an acknowledgement by you, Professor. Sorry, isn't that an acknowledgement by you? No, but on that point where you said, I'm so sorry to intervene, but I want to take you on that very point before we lose that point. Therefore, you are yourself admitting that a very shrewd America is extending this war and want Russia to be isolated, not because they care for a single Ukrainian. It's because it is, as you just admitted in your preceding sentence, it means billions and billions, maybe trillions, in business for the United States of America. You just admitted it. You just made the admission when you said more hydrocarbons. 1 minute. I caught you in there. I'm very. No, 1 minute, sir. 1 minute. Let's get into that in detail. And I would say that, Professor, thank you for your inadvertent admission, because you ended up saying a very major thing. And what you're basically trying to say is that American action throughout this war cannot be looked at solely through the lens of altruism or humanity. America is a shrewd country. Americans are very shrewd businessmen. Why do they want Russia isolated? Not because they care at all for the Ukrainians. Indians care about the Ukrainians. Americans don't. Indians are providing humanitarian aid to the Ukrainians. You are taking them to the altar and seeing them sacrificed because you are direct economic beneficiaries of such isolation. And in furtherance of your point, the point that you just admitted, Professor, which I must admit your candor and your honesty on the program tonight, isn't it true that an isolated Russia, which is the most powerful non-OPEC member, will tilt the balance in favor of the only other powerful non-OPEC member, which is the United States of America. So it's again going back to the oil business. And I wish America looked at the world through any other angle than just the oil business. Yes, please.
This will probably be the last time I'll be on this show. Because what you're doing, Adnar, is putting words in my mouth that I didn't say. What I'm saying is that Russia itself is giving Biden all of these advantages. The United States' interest was a more unified NATO and protection of Ukraine. And Putin himself broke that agreement. This is not that important for American economic development. America is the strongest economy in the world by far. It has very serious strategic concerns. Now, if you want to ask the question about isolation, there has been over a long period of time an effort by the United States to maintain its superiority on the globe. That is, as a global hegemon. And this conflict, in many ways, is between American aspirations to maintain its global hegemony and Russia's interest, by the way, also India's interest, China's interest, Iran's interest, and other powers to be regional hegemons, which the United States doesn't want to tolerate. But don't say that I'm saying that somehow the United States launched this war for economic advantage. That's kind of what we would used to call vulgar Marxism.
Okay. Well, I mean, you know, we can talk about vulgar capitalism as well. I don't want to put any, adjectives or epithets or prefixes to any particular ideology. I'd like, and I also do hope, Professor, that it's not the last time that you come on my program, because all I'm doing is giving you what then would be a very coherent intellectual counter. And in furtherance, allow me, Professor, just allow me a point. Allow me a point.
Don't misrepresent.
Allow me a point. Allow me a point. Allow me a point.
By oversimplifying.
Professor. No, I never oversimplify. But what I do very often, and which is not liked by some people, is that I provide strong intellectual counters to their argument based on facts, Professor. And my counter to you, and you just admitted that, you said we have our strategic objectives. And here's my proposition. I'm not putting it in your mouth, but here's my proposition. I think America is a very, very, very shrewd country. And there's nothing wrong in being shrewd. Every country is shrewd. The Chinese are shrewd. Right? There's no problem in being shrewd. We should all be shrewd. The Indians should also be shrewd. No problem. But what you've done is that you've created the war. And I suspect that one of the reasons you've created the war is because Russia was the biggest Middle East policy risk for America. You've been trying for years, using all kinds of instruments, Professor, to somehow eliminate, using the most undemocratic means, eliminate governments you see as unfriendly in Syria and Iran. And it's only because of Russia that you've been unable to do so. So you wanted Russia out of the way. You wanted Russia out of the way because you can't own all of the Middle East unless you neutralize Russia. Ukraine has given you a marvelous opportunity to do that, but I wish that so many thousands of Ukrainians wouldn't have to be killed to fulfill America's geopolitical aspirations, Professor.
Adnar, you're distorting the case. Russia is not a serious threat to the United States. It actually spends about 8% of what we spend on defense, and NATO itself spends 20 times on defense what Russia spends. It's not a great threat, but it does have claims and is trying to create a certain kind of hegemony over the former Soviet space, and that the United States will not tolerate. Indeed, the United States does not want to tolerate regional hegemons anywhere in the world, and it wants to get India and possibly China into the camp to try to, as you put it, isolate Russia. And what has Russia done? It's self-isolated itself. It has now become a pariah state for 90% of the globe. This was Putin's blunder. And he and Russians, Ukrainians, Americans, Indians, Chinese, we're going to pay for it.
Let me add a point.
I'll get the Chinese in. Victor Gao and Dhruv Katoch are on the debate. Dhruv Katoch is listening on keenly. Sorry to keep you waiting, Dhruv Katoch. I think I made a point there which even the Americans will agree with, and I want to just say one thing to the Americans. Please understand, Americans, you want your inflation to go, you want to prosper, your prices of wheat, your prices of bread are becoming unsustainable, and I do realize, I hope you realize, that there's much to do at home than to try and contain nations elsewhere in the world. On the use of the word hegemonistic, Professor, I have an inbuilt reluctance to even accept this word. I think it's an outrageous word. I think it's a very, very inappropriate word. And when you're saying that America would like regional hegemons to exist, I think that also ends up giving America the role of crowning nations across the world, which it doesn't have. Victor Gao is responding from China. He's been hearing. I don't want a question to him. Victor Gao, please. From Beijing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I listened very carefully to what the American panelists said just now. Allow me to mention several things. The U.S. opposition to Nord Stream 2 started way before February the 24th, 2022. It is the U.S. policy to change the energy supply to Europe from Russia to someone else, and most possibly to the United States. Now, this is not a hidden agenda. This is a well-declared agenda. So, in this sense, the United States achieved its goal. However, Russian gas through pipeline is very different from American gas through LNG, which will cost European countries a whole lot of a burden going forward. And it will not only be a burden for overnight, it will be a burden for 10 years, 20 years, or possibly 100 years to come. So in this sense, Europe being really diverting from Russian supply of gas to American supply of gas in LNG will impose a huge burden onto themselves. Sooner or later, European countries will waken up to the fact that there is a very extraordinary burden imposed onto the European countries. Secondly, in the world of today, it is a multilateral world. This is not a unilateral world dictated by the United States. If the United States wants to dictate this, it will collapse eventually. Now, talking about isolating Russia, only about 30 countries are imposing sanctions against Russia. The overwhelming majority of the international community, about 170 countries in total, do not impose sanctions against Russia. Therefore, to say the United States sanctions against Russia represent the international community is a complete lie. It represents the United States and the Western countries. It does not represent big countries like India, Brazil, South America, almost all the Middle Eastern countries, all the countries in Asia except Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and China's Taiwan province, for example. So who gives the United States the authority to say they represent the international community? No, the United States represent the Yankees. They do not represent the international community. They cannot represent India. They cannot represent China. And they cannot force China and India onto the bandwagon unleashed by the United States against Russia. Fundamentally, allow me to make a point. Excluding Russia will not lead to lasting peace in Europe. Excluding Russia with the largest nuclear arsenal will not lead to lasting peace in the world. Putin threatened to put the Russian nuclear arsenal on higher alert, and the United States is deterred. The United States does not have the courage to send a single soldier to fight in Ukraine against Russia. Do you think this indicates that the United States does not care for Russia's leading role in the world in terms of military power? No, they are not telling the truth to the world. The United States and NATO are deterred by the threat of President Putin and Russia. Why? Because the United States does not have the courage, does not have the capacity to pick a fight directly with Russia. They want to fight the war by using Ukraine as the fodder to fight a war on behalf of the United States. Pray the soul for the Ukrainians.
Burzin. Yeah, Burzin, you heard that, Burzin. It goes back to the issue of proxy war.
Yeah, so much for Chinese crocodile tears as announced. So much for Chinese crocodile tears announced in today's London Times of how Beijing was behind cyber attacks on Ukraine 24 hours before the war started on February 24th, and which began with the end of the games. 600 websites of the Ministry of Defense, Ukrainian state railways, and others were targeted. And today it has been announced in the Times, which I just held up on the paper. Your guest from Kiev would know better. And I'm calling out Mr. Gao on this. What does China have to do with the
Times? Who's the source of the Times story?
The source is the Ukrainian SBU.
Who's the source?
State Bureau of, the Ukrainian Bureau of State Intelligence. SBU has announced it. And there's and Mr. Dugan, that's
why are you laughing at that, John?
It is not.
You know what?
I have the floor.
Every outrageous claim that has been published in America has come from the Ukrainian SBU. Every outlandish claim.
I have the floor. You can have, Mr. Dugan, I have the floor. Sorry. And speaking of China, China does know how to be transactional, Arnab. Sinopec, the Chinese state energy consortium, has cancelled a gas marketing contract worth $1 billion at the beginning of this week already. And CNPC and others are following. Mr. Gao knows this for a fact, because Sinopec has pulled out for fear of secondary sanctions. And because its opposite partner, Sibur, Siberian company, was involved with having a Putin ally on board. And speaking of flip-flops, Arnab, Putin tried to call the West's bluff midweek on having payments done in rubles.
Yeah.
You know what's happened yesterday morning? He backed off. Payments are back in dollars again and Western currencies again. So he has backed off. And just as he backed off early in early March, when he told Russian mothers on public television that none of your conscript sons, poor boys 18 to 27-year-olds, are going to be sent to Ukraine to fight. And then the defense ministry had to back up and say, no, yes, conscripts have been sent to fight. And these conscripts have automatic rifles harking back to the 1940s in oversized helmets. So,
but can you isolate Russia? Burzin, all this is fine.
Yes,
all this is fine, but I have one question to you. One point to you. Burzin, just one limited point, and I'll No, I'm saying that everyone across the world is saying Putin is mad, he's crazy, he's locked himself in a nuclear bunker.
He has thyroid
Some people are saying there are some stories in the Western media that he has thyroid cancer, he's on steroids, he's not talking to people. You know, it's all right. No, all right. I tell you one thing. See, unlike you, I don't consider the Daily Telegraph of London the gospel. But my point is, my limited point is this. My point is, my essential, Burzin. Okay. Now, anyway, I'd say this to you, that, you know, Putin went to Bill Clinton and said, I want to be a part of NATO. This would never, Putin had gone to Clinton, he'd gone to America repeatedly and said, I want to be in NATO. America never allowed him. Let Professor Suni deny that. Let Derek deny that. Let anyone deny it. But Burzin, you deny that. He went. He said, I want to be in NATO. It was America which wanted to isolate him then and wants to isolate him now. Why wasn't Putin, why wasn't Russia made a part of NATO as an equal partner? Why wasn't it made? Was that offer made or not?
No, because
of course he wanted to be. No, of course he wanted to be. I'm sorry. No, 1 minute. Oh, 1 minute. I'm sorry. You're complete. No, he wanted to be. He wanted to be. He was wanted to join NATO. Let Professor Suni deny that.
He's a KGB man whose world ended in December 91, and he wants to revive these
this is your perspective.
Ambitions.
Okay, General Katoch.
was a CIA man.
You know, General Katoch.
Thank you, Arnab. Arnab, it's always a pleasure to be on this program, especially to listen to views of all the international spokespersons who have come here. And of course, it's a pleasure to partake in that. Now, I've got a few points to make, you know, because a lot of the comments have been made with relation to India's policy. Now, I want to make it very clear, India doesn't play a non-aligned game as far as Ukraine is concerned. But at the same time, India will not hyphenate its relationship with any power. So we have crossed that stage. So just because America has got certain interests does not mean that India will not deal with Russia. We will deal with Russia. We will deal with the United States. We will deal with the European Union because they are all friendly countries. And we will not hyphenate or balance our relationship with any of them. Now, having said that, I think what is really happening now is the weaponization of economics and information. And I think that is a very dangerous trend. The third point I wish to make is, the statement which was made by our American colleague, where he said that Russia has become as a pariah state in the whole world, and 90% of the world is against them. Now, I'm very chary of this figure of 90% because India is certainly not against Russia. We want the war to close, but we will not call Russia a pariah state. Neither will China, neither will most of the Arab world, neither will most of South America, neither will most of Africa. So I really don't know where that 90% figure is coming from. I think perhaps they need to have a relook at that. What I really want to talk about today is the moral argument which has been played out. Now, many years ago, Nelson Mandela, when he went to the United States, he made a very pertinent statement in one line. And he said, the mistakes which the Americans make is they think their enemies should be our enemies. Now, I think that is something which we need to understand. Each country has its own relationships with different countries, and we will deal with those countries on that particular basis and on merit. So, which is why we have a separate relationship with the Russians. We have a separate relationship with the European Union. We have a very strong relationship within the European Union with Germany and France. We have a very strong relationship with the United States. And we will deal with each of these relationships on their merit. And we will not be told that there is a moral argument that do this or do that. No. I think that is absolutely incorrect.
I think the whole
There's
story.
One final point which I wish to make.
Yeah, the whole story is yes, General. Go on.
May I make just one more point, Arnab?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is this. You see, as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, I don't think the Russian. I don't think the Russian effort was really to capture Ukraine. They wanted certain areas. I don't think Russia is short of land. I think they have far surplus of land. They have a problem as far as the coastline is concerned. And for their very survival, I think the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea is critical. So they will actually, their war effort will be confined to this particular area.
I'll get to the part. I'll get to that part as well. I'll get to that part as well. But my point here is tonight, and that's where the problem with the American friends and Derek. In America, they are presenting Vladimir Putin as the big bad wolf. And there's a profound reality that this person who you're calling the big bad wolf was repeatedly telling the West that he wants to be part of NATO. And Burzin, a lot of people responding when I said Putin wanted to be part of NATO and you absolutely were in denial. He wanted to be part of NATO. No, Alexander, it's a fact. Every time Russia was making the outreach to be part of NATO,
the case. It's not beginning in 2014. When Yeltsin was the president of Russia, Russia tried to seize Crimea in 1994, way before Putin came to power. Then Russia occupied parts of territory of Moldova, so-called Transnistria, of Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. So it's something different than
no, but I'm talking about Putin. Secondly, but Alexander, I'm talking about Putin, and I'm saying here, I'm talking about Putin. Putin at the very start of his regime.
Sorry?
I'm just saying I'm talking about Putin because Putin is the person who has started this invasion. But Putin at the start of his regime, Derek, said, I want to ally with NATO. And he said, I have the quote here, this is Breakfast with Frost on the BBC, where he explicitly said, I don't see why not. I would not rule out such a possibility when he was asked about joining NATO. It is America which pushed him into a corner over 2 decades. In fact, these are unfortunately, Professor Ronald, Professor Ronald Robertson. Robertson. Robertson, who was Secretary General of the Transatlantic Alliance between 1993 and 2003, spoke about a conversation with Putin in which Putin actually asked him, when are you going to please invite us to join NATO? These facts you don't want to accept.
Well,
you don't want to accept. Putin spoke to Clinton. Putin, US.
We were asking for
my question. Okay. Can anyone? I need to hear from the Americans. Derek and Ronald. Derek Ronald on one side. No, Derek Ronald on one side with John Mark Dougan and Victor Gao on the other.
Okay.
Why was Putin pushed into a corner and not allowed to join NATO?
Look.
Yes,
well, we can relitigate the past all we want, and I've heard a lot of that since February 24th, especially coming out of India, to be frank, and it's not helpful. What we need to do is we need to look forward to the future, and doing that means working together to stop this vicious war that Putin has launched against Ukraine. And I tried to bring up India, but it kind of, went by the wayside because I think most Indians don't want to talk about this. They feel increasing pressure from the West and from the United States in particular.
Derek, I want to talk about it.
And I'd like to
talk about it with you. I want to talk about it with you. I want to talk about it as well. Will you talk about it with me? Will you talk about it with me?
Absolutely.
Can I talk about it with you? Because you think, okay, great. Frank, offer accepted, Derek. I will put one question to you and you tell me. Let's talk about India, okay? Now, fact of the matter is, please, Derek, do not shoot off the shoulder of the Ukrainian people. It's becoming ugly. The way in which Americans are using the Ukrainian people, you feel that you can shoot off their shoulder to justify everything. Now, I'll tell you why. I'll take you back to 2018. In 2018, you tried to stymie Russian arms exports by threatening America's own friends, and you say India is a friend, with sanctions if we buy Russian weapons and military equipment, right? We had a $6 billion S-400 deal with the Russians. You tried your best. You threatened sanctions on India. There was no Ukraine war then. The problem is that you felt your own exports, your arms exports to India, which had from 2008 to 2018 reached $15 billion. You became India's number 2 weapons supplier. But you weren't happy with that. When we wanted to do an S-400 deal, you turned around and you said, listen, India, better do what we tell you to do, otherwise we'll throw sanctions at you. What you did not expect, Derek, that we looked you in the eye and basically told you to buzz off. And that's what you had to do. So since you want to talk about India, I've thrown an extremely straightforward example to you. I'll give you another example. Now, 2016, there was no Ukraine war then. You tried to take India to the WTO. Why? Because you were trying to stop us from buying certain equipment, certain solar power equipment, only to be exposed in 2019 when the WTO ruled that subsidies and mandatory local content requirements instituted by 8 American states breached global trade rules. What I'm trying to tell you is that you've been a very bad bully. You were a bully before the Ukrainian war, and you're a bully now. And you don't know how to deal with countries like India, which are telling you that stop wagging your finger at us. So yes, I'm telling you about India. Would you like to respond to any one of my 2 examples? Why didn't you respond to the examples of the attempted sanctions after the S-400 purchase?
Let me respond to that very briefly. And so CATSA, which is, I believe, what you're referring to, it's the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, that came out of Russia's invasion in 2014 and seizure of Crimea as part of Ukraine. And so the goal there was to sanction countries that bought Russian military equipment at a certain threshold. It was not designed specifically to punish India. And not only that, I would add, Arnab, as you're laughing about this, because I actually think that this is an example of the strength of the U.S.-India security partnership. The U.S. has not sanctioned India for the S-400 deal. In fact, there's been nothing out of either the Trump or the Biden administration on India's continued purchase of Russian equipment. And so I think that that is a good thing in the sense that the U.S. and India can, avoid ruining their relationship, resorting to sanctions again, like a la 1998. That's a good thing. That shows the strength of the relationship.
This is ridiculous.
No. Allow me to make one point.
No, okay, Victor wants to respond to this, please. I've made my point.
Very quickly.
Or John,
first of all,
either of you.
For the United States to threaten to impose sanctions on India for its purchase of Russian arms, it is completely an act of irresponsibility. Why? Because the United States does not have any legal standing.
It wasn't specifically on India. It wasn't
to impose sanctions
on
India for buying weapons from Russia. So the United States need to wake up. It's no longer a world dictated by the United States. It's a world in which the United States need to treat India as an equal. Respect India. And I'm saying this from China's perspective. Respect India as a great country. Don't manhandle India. Don't lecture India. Don't dictate your terms to India. Don't threaten to impose sanctions. Your sanctions are laughingstocks in the world.
The U.S.-India partnership has come a long way, especially in the last few years. I think relations are the best they've ever been between the U.S. and India. And what I'm saying is the fact that we did not impose CAATSA sanctions after India purchased the S-400 is a big deal, and that's a positive for the U.S.-India partnership.
This is
it's actually not a positive. Maybe it's not a positive for China, and you guys are upset that there's not a wedge between the U.S. and India, right, on CAATSA, because that would have benefited you guys, so maybe you're upset about that. And I'm sorry to
China does not look at the world in your narrowly defined way. We look at the world at least in terms of 100 years. You look at it in half a year, and then you will lose direction of where you want to lead the world to. Wake up. Adopt a longer perspective. Look at the world in 100 years rather than threaten to impose sanctions on India. It's really obscene and shameful to even think about that.
Nobody wants a China-dominated world.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I would just say that
anything to the world.
You will not be dominated by China, sir. You will not be dominated by China.
Tell that to the Africans and tell that to the Sri Lankans who are hocked in debt to you, and Maldives whose 100% debt is in your hands. And so called BRI string of pearls.
But Borzin, India has given over $1 billion line of credit to Sri Lanka to help.
Yes, but
India has given over billions of dollars to Sri Lanka to help.
Ask the Nigerians. Ask the Nigerians. Ask what has happened to Hambantota Port.
We'll go into that. We'll go into that. We'll go into that. I tell you this, India is the only stable partner in Asia right now. And I think we've had divergent opinion, but I love all of you to come back into my debate.